So, um, Aber Kawas, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Um, you won the New York State Senate primary last week, so congratulations is in order.
Thank you.
And I wanted to start by asking you, kind of about your experience of, if you win in November, you'll be the first Palestinian-American to hold a seat in the entire New York State. What does that kind of mean to you?
It means a lot. I think that winning in this time period feels really meaningful because as a Palestinian, it's not just about being the first person or first this or that, but it's part of being a representative from a community that has been very much politically sidelined for so long. And the Palestinian cause and speaking up for Palestinian liberation, Palestinian human rights has been something that has been ignored by the political establishment at large and many in New York State.
Mm. So I wanted to speak to you. I wanted, this kind of rise of the democratic socialists among the Democrats has been all the hype this week. Um, do you think there's been a democratic socialist insurgency, so to speak? And why do you think these wins in the Democratic primaries, like Milak Kiros in Denver, Brad Lander, Claire Valdez in New York, what do you think this says about the mood among Democratic voters?
I think what is really amazing about this moment is that there has always seemed to be a divide between the activists and the organizers on the streets and what they're talking about and what people in politics are talking about. So what this huge wave is about an opportunity that we are seeing for people to be elected. With these principles, with these values, with these viewpoints, people are so tired of seeing people who are their political representation not talking about the everyday things that they are thinking about in their lives. And I think that's why we all got voted in. Um, whatever statements we made that people said were controversial, whatever viewpoints that we have that people think are controversial, are actually the things that voters are wanting to vote for.
Um, so talking about the kind of response to you guys as being controversial, obviously President Donald Trump has referred to democratic socialists as the biggest threat to the US. He's called you communists. Um, is your cause a threat, and why does he seem to think so?
Um, I find it, of course, I find it comical. Really, what most of our platforms are saying is very simple. We want people to be able to afford their groceries. We want people to be able to afford their rent. We want people to be able to afford their healthcare. We want people to have just dignified lives. And that is US citizens to be able, and residents, people who live in the United States, we want them to have safety, right? So we're called a safety concern when we are actually advocating for safety. Our president wants billionaires to thrive, and our president is advocating for global destruction, whether that's climate destruction, whether that's violence against others, whether that's genocide, and promoting all that and funding that. And so, who really is the threat?
The criticism of this rise of democratic socialists isn't by any means confined to the Republican Party. There's been undeniable pushback from kind of the old guard of the Democratic Party. Um, so let's talk a little bit about what separates you from the more moderate Democrats. I kind of want to understand how much this apparent chasm is affecting cohesion within the party.
Yes. I think people want to narrow it down to Palestine being a wedge issue that separates us. I would say that is one of the issues. And we saw that happen in the last presidential election. We saw that the Biden administration's failure and actually aiding and abetting of the genocide in Gaza, but then also Kamala Harris's failure to address that properly was something that disenfranchised voters, that disillusioned voters. And people have been blaming the voters, but I think that what we are seeing for the Democratic Party is that they have not given the voters a better alternative for them to vote for. And beyond that, of course, being a wedge issue, which is so meaningful, right? I also think that the thing that differentiates Democratic Socialists from the old guard of the Democratic establishment is one, our urgency. We are looking at issues and saying we need to create solutions now. We are in a place where our Democratic Party has put us in a place where we are talking about immigration as a fight against ICE. Immigration should have been a fight for proactive pathways to citizenship for people, for proactive ways to legalize people being able to work in this country, to be able to thrive in this country. So now the Democratic Party in the last many years has been so slow to fight for that that we are in a defensive posture. Same thing with climate change. Same thing with the affordability crisis. The fight for free healthcare, universal healthcare. Universal healthcare exists in other countries. We are living in the most wealthy country in the world, and yet we don't have universal healthcare for our citizens, for our residents, right? So I think it's about urgency and about us making sure that the government is providing and not just letting it be that private companies or private equity is running the show in our country anymore.
So you're sort of talking about this sort of like it's a solutions based campaign. It's sort of it's an urgency that we perhaps don't have elsewhere among the Democrats. Sort of going back to the issue of Israel and Palestine, something that the Democratic Party hasn't been able to do is disentangle themselves from the Israel lobby, from organizations such as AIPAC. How do you, or how do the Democratic Socialists from the Democratic Party hope to achieve this?
Yes, that this is a really important question because we have a lot of questions about why the Democratic establishment is so entangled with lobbyists like the AIPAC lobby. When the Democratic establishment is calling out Trump, they're calling Trump a fascist, and yet they are entangled with a fascist state, the state of Israel. That is a form of hypocrisy that so many voters are seeing. That is a form of discrepancy that so many voters are seeing. How can you speak and say, I want to abolish ICE, I'm against ICE kidnapping people off the streets, and yet I support a state that it's not just about that it's committed a genocide, that every single human rights organization, right, globally has named a genocide, but it's a state that has also been an apartheid state, been an occupying state for years and years. This isn't something new. And the fact that the Democratic establishment has been so embedded with the state of Israel is a question of concern because what it is doing, it's not allowing a differentiation from the fascist, government that we're seeing. If you want to call Republicans fascists, but you are supporting fascists in another state, then you are not being consistent in your politics. So what Democratic socialists are doing very much we are humanizing politics. We are creating a politics of consistency, a politics of urgency, and a politics that says if you're going to fight for human rights here in the United States, then you have to make sure you're doing that consistently on a global level.
And I wanted to speak to you a little bit. You know, you've spoken about ICE and kind of the increasingly authoritarian and dystopian stance that the Trump administration seems to have on immigration. And I know that your dad was deported. If you could just tell us a little bit about your Palestinian heritage and like, yeah, your family, and you know, you've won something very exciting, but obviously there's somebody that you can't celebrate with in person.
Yes, thank you for asking about that. You know, the story of my family in many ways embodies the story of the Palestinian people. Because the story of the Palestinian people has been a story of our land being taken and us being dispossessed from our homeland. And that happens in many ways. That happens when there are people who are living in refugee camps in Palestine, or living under occupation in Gaza. But more so, we have millions of Palestinians who have been displaced globally from their homeland. And when we have been displaced for generations outside of Palestine, what we have faced is more and more oppression. For example, my parents grew up as refugees in Jordan. They came to the United States as economic migrants, as economic refugees, to have a better life. After, many years living in the States, in the post 9/11 period, then Muslim Americans, Arab Americans get targeted in the United States, and my parents who are undocumented living here get targeted under that apparatus. And in the worst case, my father, gets arrested. He's put in ICE detention for 3 years. He gets deported. We face family separation and dispossession once more. it's just this like cycle of violence that we are facing, and that is due to political choices that everyday families suffer from. So in the end, I was able to make history as the first, hopefully Palestinian to be elected in New York State, and my father is not home. He's not there with me, and that is really sad, and that is what so many families face under this really cruel immigration system. Is that our livelihoods and our happiness and our safety gets taken away constantly and for long term.
I kind of wanted, I feel like it's clear that this kind of insurgence of victories of vocally pro-Palestine candidates has kind of sent these shockwaves to the democratic establishment that Israel's genocide in Gaza is an issue that needs to be taken seriously. But I think, and polls show that this might reflect a broader trend. The Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, one of the biggest socialist organizations in the US, has grown from about 5,000 to over 100,000 members across the country. And polls show that roughly, I think it's 40% of Americans and two-thirds of Democrats are viewing socialism favorably. Do you think that this is as a response to perhaps the growing allure of progressive politicians, the Mamdani effect, or do you think this is a response to the increasingly authoritarian Trump administration? Or kind of how would you characterize this shift?
I see it as a natural response to authoritarianism. For us, we always say in the DSA that the antidote to fascism is socialism, right? That if you are seeing the worst of humanity being enacted, what people will fight for is the best of humanity. And I think that people have always had that notion and that has always been the solution. But what I will say is, yeah, I think the Mamdani effect and this growth um, of people coming into office is part of that wave. I think what Mamdani proved to everyone was that you can get elected. It was a watershed moment because people thought that people knew that there were people who had these viewpoints, principled ideas about affordability, about humanity, about global conflict. But we always thought that you couldn't get elected if you had those views. And the unprecedented way that Mamdani won the mayoral victory, what we call the people's victory, that was a mayoral victory, but that was part of decades of community organizing and activism that existed. And this shakeup to the Democratic Party needs to be taken seriously. I think everyone needs to re-examine what they stand for. And what we are hoping to be is that guiding light for people. And we're also hoping to be successful. We don't want to just have ideological wins. We want material wins for people, and people are looking for that in their lives right now.
We saw the kind of acute Islamophobia faced by Zohran Mamdani, New York mayor. I've seen posts about yourself, about Millet Kiros, talking about you guys being apologists of 9/11, radicals who downplay terrorism and expect apologies from the West. Read one social media post, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about whether that's something that you've felt intensely throughout this campaign.
It's been really interesting because we were being attacked by the right wing before we even announced our campaign many, many months ago. And when I was deciding if I should run for office, this was something that so many people warned me about, that the right wing was not going to take kindly to a Muslim hijabi wearing woman running, but also running on the platform that I was going to be running on. And I see it in two ways. Um, as much as it was daunting at first, the actual experience of running the campaign took away that feeling of dauntingness and nervousness because I saw so many people be excited about our campaign. I think I was wondering, as a Muslim hijabi woman with, a kind of like ethnic name, hey, are people going to vote for me? And when we were out there on election day, but even in the early voting period, and we just saw people so enthusiastically excited about our campaign, for me, that was a real anecdote. For me, that was something that told me that what we are seeing online is so different than what people are experiencing on the ground. The fear mongering is no longer affecting people. The spreading of blatant misinformation is no longer really having an effect on voters because voters are looking for something different. Voters have seen what true fear and violence is. It's not us advocating for affordability. True violence is what we saw in Gaza. True violence is the apocalyptic scenes that we saw that was funded by our tax money. Voters see beyond all of these lies and all of this hatred, and I think that's a really beautiful thing, and it makes me really hopeful for the future that we can build.